Thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor to be with the Southeastern Massachusetts Coalition for a Free Palestine. I really like the ring of that. And I'm grateful to my friend and fellow law professor Faisal Chowdhury for serving as sort of the go-between in organizing this. I'm a professor, Wyatt Tarrant and Combs Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. I'm currently under suspension and banned from the law school for my opposition to Israel. I'm going to be speaking about the history of Algeria and of the end to French Algeria, and what that potentially has to teach us about bringing the state of Israel to an end. I come at this partly from a personal perspective. My mother was from Algeria, and so I have some familiarity with the country. And this is also part of a personal exploration that is relatively recent in sort of my academic trajectory. So I'm going to be talking about sort of an active area of research for me, and there may be some of you in the audience have some familiarity with these issues who can inform this research, and I very much welcome that and look forward to having a conversation with folks about this. So let's talk first a little bit about the history of the colonization of Algeria, and then I want to get into why I think you might approach this topic and say, well, what does Israel-Palestine have to do with the colonization of Algeria? Algeria was a formal colonization project of France. It was incorporated into France as part of the nation. It wasn't treated as a formally separate overseas colony, but as France is divided into departments, administrative departments, and so Algeria was considered, several departments of France. And so, for example, when France joined the European Economic Community and signed the Treaty of Rome in the late 1950s, Algeria became part of the European Economic Community because it was considered formally part of France. So you might say, well, what does this have to do with Israel-Palestine, where you've got a formally separate, sovereign entity, Israel? This is a separate thing. And so, talking a little bit about this history, I think is going to help us see why actually the issue of Israel-Palestine is indistinguishable from the broader issue of colonialism that we mostly solved in a formal sense in the 20th century. And so I'm hoping that this exercise is going to help sort of draw parallels and see why really maybe Israel is only unique in the sense that it still exists as far as colonization goes, but other than that is really a run-of-the-mill example of a Western colonization project. So Algeria, French colonization starts in 1830. What the French called pacification of Algeria didn't happen until 1903. So over the course of 70 years, there was really a brutal long-term struggle. By 1870, about a third of the native Algerian population had been killed by the French through everything ranging from executions, use of concentration camps, starvation, and disease. French citizenship, so the structure of inequality in colonial Algeria, took, the more time you spend looking at colonialism, the more you realize that, inequality and apartheid always seems to exist in the law in these very subtle ways. It's very rarely as blatant as what you had in South Africa. And so in the case of colonial Algeria, France, starting in the mid-19th century, said, "Oh yeah, we're willing to extend French citizenship and hence voting rights to anyone in Algeria, native or settler, But if you are a Muslim, you have to renounce Islamic law in order to get that citizenship and those voting rights. And so, Algerians experience that as essentially a demand that you renounce your identity. And very few Algerians were willing to do that. An interesting contrast was that in 1860, the French, as part of a divide and conquer strategy, automatically extended French citizenship to native Jewish Algerians. So it was very much, part of and that was part of a policy of sort of divide and conquer. See if we can find, minority groups, so to speak, within Algeria, and if we can privilege them, we can get their allegiance, and that, helps us to have sort of native, native informants or native collaborators. Or they try to convert particular groups into collaborators. And so through this sort of, this mechanism of requiring renunciation of religious law, they were able effectively to create an apartheid state, one in which native Algerians, and 95+% of Algerians were Muslim, were not able to participate fully in terms of political rights. So, so this situation of inequality, political inequality, led to sort of a long-term immiseration of the native Algerian population. So over time, the economic status of Algerians actually declined during the colonial period. At the same time, and I think this is quite relevant in thinking about Israel-Palestine, most of the immigration of settlers, European settlers, to Algeria actually happened in the 19th century. There was very little increase in the settler population after about 1900. And so when you get to the Algerian War for Independence, which started in 1954, you had a settler community that, many of whom were, third, fourth generation settlers within Algeria. And you also have, this was 1830, so by the time Algeria gets independence in 1962, you've got, 130 years of colonialism, and we can compare that with the colonization of Palestine, which starts with a few, sort of failed attempts in the early 1880s, one of which was financed by the Rothschilds, and then really sort of gets off the ground, in the early 1900s. In terms, when we look at the length of the colonization project, we see that the French colonization project in Algeria, was longer, right? It was older at the time that it was brought to an end than the colonization project in Palestine is, at the moment. So you have pacification end in the early 1900s, and then in 1954 you have an heretofore unknown organization, the Front for National Liberation, FLN, using the French acronym, initiates armed struggle, and very quickly, the French government responds by sending tens of thousands of soldiers into Algeria to put down this revolt. It's, I think, really important and really relevant to the way we think about what's going on in Palestine, that the buildup of troops and the initial sort of gloves off genocidal response of the French government to this resistance was carried out by initially a center-left government, and then by a full-on socialist government. And it wasn't until the right, under Charles de Gaulle, came to power in 1958 as a direct result, actually, I'll get into that in a second, of the response of the settlers, that you had a conservative government in power. And so starting in 1954, you get this huge ramping up of troops. Within a few years, you have 500,000 French soldiers, and they are, there's a state of emergency that's declared. Concentration camps are set up. Algeria is divided into 3 zones. One of these zones is a zone, where everybody in the zone is relocated effectively to concentration camps or to villages. We think about this in terms of the ongoing plan for Gaza now, relocated into special villages that were created, internment villages that were created for them. And you also had, interestingly, you had concentration camps in France, mainland France, as well, that were set up for Algerians. So this was something that happened not only in Algeria, but also in France. You also had, very severe, restrictions on the press. You had certain Frenchmen who were calling for an end to the war were banned from appearing on television or on the radio. So it was a very, extreme response, not just in the colony, but also in the metropole. And that makes us think a little bit about what's going on right now with respect to Israel and Palestine. So part of this response of the French, was torture. It was an institutionalized approach to torture. There was, actually some of the military commanders that were leading it had a theory. They had a theory of revolutionary war in which, one of the parts of putting down, revolutionary resistance is torture. You use torture to have a psychological effect on the enemy, to reshape the enemy into a new kind of person who is subservient. So there was an institutionalized use of torture as part of this. You had, estimates range from the hundreds of thousands of Algerians who were killed to several million, during this process. You had, widespread use of rape by the French military as a weapon of war. Everything that you can imagine. Folks have called this an experience that was similar to Vietnam, for the U.S., which happened a few years later. And very, in a sense, it was the French Vietnam. So the settler community, you had about 1 million settlers, at that time. And, when we think about the settler population in Palestine right now, you say, well, we've got close to 8 million settlers in Palestine right now, but it's important to realize that there's population growth. So, that 1 million strong settler community, if it had remained in Algeria, would be about, the size of the settler community in Palestine that we have today. There's a lot of interesting parallels here in this history. The settler community revolts in 1958 in Algiers, and basically it's very concerned that the French government might be wavering. The costs of the war are spiraling out of control, and they want victory at all costs. And as a result of this protest in Algiers, the French government falls, and de Gaulle comes back from 10 years of retirement to take over. And interestingly, also for thinking about the dynamic in American politics, de Gaulle is the first time in this bloody struggle to preserve the colony that you have a right-wing government in France. And so when he's campaigning, he comes to Algeria and he says, he says to the settlers, "I have understood you." This was a famous, "I've understood you." So the settlers felt that meant that he supported them. But within about, a few months of him actually taking control, it becomes very clear that he's decided that, that Algeria has become too costly for France and he's going to cut the cord. And so the settlers feel betrayed, and the military also feels betrayed. So in 1961, the military tries to carry out a putsch and take over the government. They take over the government of Algeria, but they're not able to cross the Mediterranean and take over the government in Paris. But there's some famous scenes of anti-aircraft guns that are put on the roof of the government, the Élysée Palace in Paris, because they're afraid that French paratroopers are going to fly, from Algeria and assault Paris and depose de Gaulle. There's several assassination attempts are made against de Gaulle. Those who've seen Day of the Jackal, that's a fictionalized version of one of those. And so so you've got this, revoltant part of the military, but it fails and fails pretty quickly. And some of the military leaders and some of the civilian leaders who supported it go underground in Algeria. And they form a terrorist organization called the OAS, the Secret Armed Organization, French acronym for Secret Armed Organization. And they very successfully organize basically the entire settler community to resist decolonization. And so their targets are not only Algerians, native Algerians, and they're bombing marketplaces and killing Algerians, but their targets are also de Gaulle's administration and the army, which increasingly is siding with de Gaulle after the failed putsch. And so you have this incredibly brutal clash, 1961 and 1962, between basically the settler organization and the French state. And there's wonderful translation of work by Benjamin Stora, who's sort of the leading historian of these events, in my view. And there's a nice translation of some of his work, which I like to consult. And so he gives some figures of the extent of the violence, at this time in France. Let's see if I can find it here. So, they're carrying out hundreds of attacks in Algeria, and at the same time, they're carrying out attacks in France. So in France, there are bombings this is January 1962 and February 1962, 40 attacks between January 15th and January 21st, including 25 in Paris, 18 on a single night, January 17th to 18th, 33 January 22nd and 28th, 23 in Paris, 34 between February 5th and 11th, including 27 in Paris. And in Algeria, 800 attacks over the same period, causing more than 500 deaths, thousands of injuries. So the scale of this sort of terrorist, 500 dead through 800 attacks, and these are primarily bombings, assassinations. The scale of the violence is totally off the charts, not just in Algeria but also in France. And that I think is something that we need to think about also. As it becomes clearer, eventually that the United States will cut the cord with Israel. What are the consequences going to be, both in Palestine but also here in the United States? And I think it should give us pause and think a little bit about the extent to which we might see violence also in this country, and an equivalent, to what we saw in France at that time. So so de Gaulle starts in 1960 to negotiate directly with the FLN. And the FLN is interesting to compare it with Palestinian resistance faction. Now, obviously, the Palestinians have suffered, in a way that the Algerians, for everything that they went through, never experienced. I mean, the Algerians started their revolution in 1954. By 1962, they had their freedom. The Palestinians have been fighting for generations and still don't have theirs. So there's a very different dynamic there. But it's also, I think, worthwhile thinking a little bit about the approaches of the two groups. The FLN, it was quite explicit about its willingness to attack civilians in order to achieve political ends. And we can contrast this with what we know about the Aqsa flood October 7th attacks, which was that they were essentially military in nature. I mean, the Palestinians attacked the headquarters of the military division that was surrounding Gaza and had been effectively blockading it for 2 decades. They killed, I think 4 colonels, dozens of officers, and hundreds of soldiers. These are all military targets. And then they had, the objective of taking civilian hostages to exchange for the tens of thousands of Palestinians, including children, who are hostages of the state of Israel. But they didn't have as far as we know, an objective of killing civilians. In fact, that would have been counterproductive because the more civilians they're able to take as hostage, the stronger their bargaining position. The FLN in 1955, mounted an attack in which it, specifically targeted civilians, women and children, and that was actually one of the ways in which it managed to expand, the resistance projects. This famous Philippeville attack, when the French governor of Algeria saw, the mutilated corpses of the French civilians, it triggered something in his head, and that was the moment when the French took the gloves off in terms of their response and, embraced torture, and that led to, because they did that, obviously alienated the Algerian population and led to a cycle that ultimately, one can argue, led to the liberation of Algeria. So the FLN was, was willing to, in many ways, had an approach to resistance that was more brutal than the approach, Palestinian resistance factions. And I think it's important to realize that that was successful for them. Another thing is that the FLN effectively didn't change its demands from the beginning of the war right through to the end. It was, and I think this is also really important, it was anti-assimilationist. So, what's interesting about the Israel-Palestine dynamic is in many quarters it's considered sort of progressive and revolutionary to argue for a kind of integrationist solution to the Palestine question. That what we want is we want one state where everybody lives together in a kind of, integrated, it's sort of like an American-style melting pot solution to the Palestine question. And, that was the position really of the French government and most of the anti-colonial French right from the beginning of the Algerian War was, yes, we haven't fulfilled our promise of making these Algerians truly French citizens, so we're going to reform our laws, we're going to give more political participation to Algerians, this is where we're going, we're moving towards assimilation, we just have to wipe out these bandits who are revolting, and then we're going to get to this like assimilationist future paradise. And the FLN rejected that, so assimilation was rejected. And really the interesting, and this assimilationist idea was current among the center-left and socialist governments that were carrying out, mass institutionalized torture of Algerians. The goal is, I suppose if we torture them enough, they'll assimilate, right? And we'll just have, Algeria will truly be France, and everyone in Algeria will be a French citizen. And French leaders were saying that. They were saying, everywhere I go in Algeria, I just see French citizens, right? And so what's interesting is when de Gaulle takes power, the right takes power, there's almost an alignment between the, the right, the French right, which doesn't see Algerians, isn't willing to entertain this idea of assimilation. De Gaulle referred to it dismissively as Gallicization of the Algerians, right? They're not Gauls, they're not Gaelic, right? They're different. And so part of his policy of cutting the cord is, okay, these are different peoples. And that was also the position of the FLN. And the FLN's position was, no, we don't want assimilation. This is a separate nation. This is a separate people, even though formally it's been incorporated into France and recognized by the UN, right? When France, became a founding member of the UN, its borders included Algeria. And this was true, we don't realize this, with the UN. The UN started as being a collection of colonial empires. And so formally, when Algeria got independence, it was formally seceding from the nation of France. And this is, I think, another important aspect of the parallel is to understand the way in which international law has really never been helpful in decolonization projects. So international law was definitely against decolonization of Algeria because secession is one of the, one of the worst things you can do in international law is engage in armed secession, right? That's because in international law, the state is the basic unit of international law. State sovereignty is sacred. And so if you're using armed revolt to secede, you're destroying, a rights-bearing entity of international law. You're pulling it into two pieces through force. And so international law was, effectively against what the FLN was doing. And, obviously we see in the context of Israel and Palestine, similar thing. The international community recognizes Israel as being a sovereign nation. So if you argue that Israel should be brought to an end, you are in some sense, going against, a basic rights-bearing unit of international law in the exact same way that the Algerian resistance was doing that. So to go back to 1960, de Gaulle starts to negotiate with the FLN, which has throughout maintained the same basic position that, we don't want assimilation, we want to have our own country, right? And that contrasts, I think, with the way the position of some Palestinian factions has shifted over time, right? So, for example, if you think about the Islamic resistance, folks call it Hamas. I always say, it's like, when I was studying Marx, my professor said, there's only two books, written in German whose titles we don't translate. Das Kapital is Marx, Capital, and the other is Mein Kampf, Hitler, right? So, these books, when we want to sort of, say that we don't like a writer, we don't translate the name, right? So, we don't, it's the Israel Defense Forces, they don't, apparently it's called, Zahal or something, in Hebrew, and we never say Zahal, but we say Hamas, right? So I like to say Islamic resistance, which is what Hamas is named. But so, the Islamic resistance says, yeah, we'll accept a two-state solution, at least provisionally, right? And so, something you didn't have with the FLN was that. The FLN never compromised at all in its aim, even provisionally throughout the struggle. So there's a sense in which the FLN was really, it was, willing to target, civilians, and it wasn't willing to compromise. And so I think that paints the position of Palestinian resistance, in a favorable light, in the sense that, here you have groups that have been struggling for longer, that are more accommodating and more respectful of civilian life, than what you had in the case of Algeria. So 1960 rolls around, de Gaulle's willing to negotiate with the FLN, and it culminates in an agreement, known as the Évian Accords in March of 1962. And, just as a side note, one of the, you see the craziness of this settler organization at the time. They assassinated the mayor of Évian, who had nothing to do with the agreement, simply because this mayor had allowed the negotiations to take place in their city. So there was just a level of, extremism that I think, ended up being counterproductive and really sort of turned off, French public opinion. But so we get to, and I just want to read a little bit of the text here, because I think it's important for visualizing. One of the nice things about looking at the Algerian question is you can visualize a little bit how this is all going to end with respect to Israel and Palestine. So, so one day, yes?
The book you're reading from?
This is, so Benjamin Stora is, I think really the best historian of the Algerian War. And he writes in French. There's a translation that I have here, a collection of some of his translated works, which is called Algeria 1830 to 2000, Short History, which provides a nice summary of a lot of the issues. So, so when de Gaulle first made clear that he was going to cut the cord, it was in 1959, he gave a television address, and this is what he said to France. He said, "Given all the facts in Algeria, national and international, I consider it necessary that the recourse to self-determination be proclaimed beginning today. In the name of France and the Republic, by virtue of the power vested in me by the Constitution, blah, 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 I commit myself to asking the Algerians what they definitively want to be, and on the other, all the French people to endorse that choice. And I think that language is really important because I think it's lost in the debate over Palestine. Everybody has a position on what a liberated Palestine should be. Some people say, well, everyone has to be equal. There should be, citizenship for. There should be citizenship for everybody who's currently living there. And if you take a genuinely anti-colonial perspective, and you say, well, actually, Palestine belongs to the Palestinians, the real question is, what do the Palestinians want, right? And what if they don't want to grant citizenship to the colonizer population? As sovereigns, they have a right to do that. They have a right to control their borders. By the same token, right, if they want to say, we want to have a theocracy, they have a right to do that. There's no international ban on theocracies in international law. You can have a theocracy and you still have a right to exist as a country. If you want to have an autocracy, you still have a right to exist under international law, and the Palestinians have a right to choose that. If, as I hope that they would do, they would want to have a democracy, they have a right to do that too. But the point is, the Palestinians have a right to choose their own constitution everywhere from the river to the sea. And now beyond, since that phrase became current, the Israeli military is now ranged, through southern Lebanon and, through Syria, so that's no longer even a current phrase anymore, right? This expansionist regime is no longer itself even bounded by the river. So, but I think it's very important, when we think about this, to see that this is what de Gaulle said. He said to the Algerians, he said, you get to decide, and we have to listen to you. That's what de Gaulle said. Here, I'll read it again. I commit myself to asking the Algerians what they definitively want to be, and on the other, all the French people to endorse that choice. So I think that's very important. And he also explicitly used the phrase decolonization. So he said, decolonization is now the policy of France. So I've been, I had set the timer I was asked to speak for 30 minutes. So I don't want to go, too far over, and feel free to stop me if I'm speaking too long. But I haven't, fully touched, I think, on, this issue of anti-colonial thinking versus integrationist thinking. And I just want to sort of come back to that and sort of wrap up by really sort of driving that home. I think we have to understand that Israel is a garden variety Western colonization project. It is, you say, well, there are Israelis from, putting aside the Arab population, which is the population that the Zionist movement wasn't able to exterminate in 1948, right? That's why they're there, and that's it. Put that aside, you've got communities from all over the world that have moved to Palestine to settle. You've got communities from Morocco, you've got communities from Iraq, you've got communities from all over Europe. So doesn't that make Israel not a garden variety Western colonization project? The answer is no. We can look at the Algerian situation. The majority of settlers in Algeria were not ethnically French. Colonization is always about winning a demographic battle. And so the French encouraged immigration from all sorts of impoverished groups throughout Europe in order to build up the size of that European settler group so that they could maintain tighter control over the colony. And so the majority of the French settlers were actually from Spain or from Italy or from other parts of Europe that in the 19th century were suffering war and privation and were looking for a better life. Right? Another classic argument that we hear in the context of Israel is, well, here you've got a European group that was subject to the Holocaust, was subject to persecution in Europe. Does that make this different? The answer is no. Colonization is almost always carried out by groups that are subject to oppression, whether economic or political, in Europe. That's why they have an incentive to move. In South Africa, it was the Huguenots. Here it was the Puritans, right? So that's absolutely par for the course in the colonial context. We also have this issue of a perceived ancient attachment to the land.
Yes.
Right? And we had that with French Algeria also. There were French writers who said, look, Algeria used to be part of the Roman Empire, just like France. And it wasn't until those Arabs invaded after the fall of the Roman Empire and drove out all the former Latins that it ended up having its Muslim and Arab character. So what we're doing in crossing the Mediterranean is coming home. That's what they said. That's what they said. So, this story of a return, right, and of an ancient claim is also par for the course in the colonial context. And it's something that we saw in Algeria as well. So I don't want to go on too long, so I'll stop there. But happy to to answer questions, and thank you again for having me. Yes.
Was there participation in World War II? I saw a movie about the Algerian soldiers in World War II and how horribly they were treated, sent right into Nazi, aggression, and then denied pensions at the end of the war. Was that a factor in forming the FLN?
Yes, the sort of core, many members of the core group that founded the FLN, were influenced by experiences in World War II. Actually, I believe that Ahmed Ben Bella was the first president of Algeria. Had been in the French military, and that experience, being fighting for the metropole, but then not being treated as an equal is, that's a theme throughout a lot of decolonization stories.
I think with African Americans in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Did they, I know you mentioned figures about how many people, Algerians were killed. Is it like, you said hundreds of thousands and then you said millions. Do we know precisely?
We don't.
We don't.
And there's really, it's interesting, there is no authoritative history of the Algerian War written by an Algerian scholar in Algeria. I was really surprised to find this when I started my research. So, there's some good, writers, in France who are, appointed at French schools. So there's just, in that, may have something to do with the sort of post-neo-colonial, post-colonial dynamics, may have something to do with the politics of post-independence Algeria. But I think that there's just a lot of, research that's yet to be done to uncover, what exactly happened. But the Algerian position is that it was in the millions. The French position is that it was, maybe 500,000. Either way, it's a tremendous loss of life.
And it sounds very familiar to what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians, because they keep denying the breadth and depth of the amount of killing and wounding that the Israelis have caused. And then you get the Lancet in Britain that says, listen, we don't think it's like 300,000 or 400,000. We think it's over 500,000 people that have been killed and so once again, there's
Well, you're pointing to a really important thing, which is in the context of colonialism, right? The lives of the colonizers are counted precisely and valued highly, and the lives of the colonized, we never even know how many people are killed. And it's consistently like that in every single conflict, not just because the numbers are so large, but also because, there's a desire not to know. And I think that's what we're seeing. And, I'm just reminded, actually, speaking, something I didn't get to in my talk, but I wanted to talk about is, what happened to the French settler population after 1962? And the answer is that in March, the Evian Accords were signed, the handover was in July, and between March and July, virtually all of the settlers left.
Wow.
So, it was called the suitcase or the coffin. That was their view. That there was a sense that they were afraid that they would be the victims of retribution. Although, in fact, there's not much evidence of that actually happening. But they feared it. And so I like to think about what happened in Algeria between March and July of 1962 as being a little bit like what in the American context we call white flight. So it was this idea that we don't want to live. So under the Evian Accords, every French settler was granted dual nationality for 3 years, after which they would have the option to choose whether they wanted to be permanent residents but retain French citizenship or take on Algerian citizenship. And they were also, their property was guaranteed, the right of property was guaranteed. So the Algerian government committed not to seize French property without providing just compensation. This is very interesting when we think about this in relation to the right of return for Palestinians. So Palestinians, through the right of return, have preserved effectively property rights, right, in colonized Palestine, and so in a way, the Evian Accords were much more generous to the French settlers than they were getting a lot more than what they should have gotten from a decolonial perspective. And even if we look at the Palestinians who have been, oppressed and mistreated, also in terms of their international law rights, they retain a greater, right to property than the Algerians did, because the French settlers owned vast amounts of the best parts of Algeria, right? They were the great landowners, right? They owned the center cities and everything. But they didn't. They chose instead to leave, and partly, it's not well explained. Partly, it was common at the time apparently to say, well, we've engaged in such a dirty war against the Algerians that what if they tried to take revenge against us? But in any event, they all left, and I think that's also a really important lesson, which is the willingness of the colonizer and of settlers to kill, to maintain the colony, sends a totally false signal regarding the importance to them of remaining there. Right? So they're happy to kill millions of people, but as soon as it becomes clear that they'll have to live as equals, suddenly it's just not that important to them to stay. Right? And so I think it's important to think about that also in relation to Israel and Palestine. Because often one hears the argument that, the settler community in Palestine, would never be, it would just be a bloodbath because they would never be willing to give up their land. Yes.
So could you say something about the first couple of years, 3 or 4 years after independence? What was going on with the government? How did they form the government and everything?
So I don't know too much about internal Algerian politics, which are very very complex and not well studied, as I mentioned. But you had you had a conflict between. So during the war, the leaders of the FLN were actually something that's reminiscent of sort of the way Israel deals with Palestinians. So they were the FLN's political leadership was in a plane flying from Morocco to Tunisia at the beginning of the war. The French, intercepted the plane and put all of these political leaders under, in jail basically for the duration of the war, and then let them out at the end when they were, when they were negotiating. So you had the leadership was, in this sort of separated from the commanders on the ground who were fighting in Algeria. And then, France had just granted independence to these two sort of protectorates, Morocco and Tunisia, right at the beginning of the war. And in fact, the FLN's first attack sort of accelerated that process. And particularly Tunisia provided a huge amount of support, basing for FLN fighters. And so to prevent the FLN fighters from infiltrating across the border and into Algeria, the French set up, kind of like a Maginot Line type deal. If you're familiar with the World War II, line to keep the Germans out. It was like electrified fencing with, and it's like Israel today with the, the remote control machine guns, around the wall in Gaza. They had remote control artillery, and with radar. So like if an Algerian commando unit in Tunisia came close to the border, the artillery would just automatically fire at them, and it was actually very effective. So it kept the sort of FLN regulars that were being trained and equipped in Tunisia from getting into Algeria, and it isolated the country and it isolated the military leadership, which was in Tunisia. And so at the end of the war, you had this this gulf between the commanders who were in Algeria and had been cut off and had their own view of sort of where the country should go, and the political leadership that had been in jail, and the military commander, of the sort of forces outside. And you had a kind of struggle for power in which ultimately the commander of the military forces, Houari Boumediene, ended up taking control. So Ahmed Ben Bella, who was part of the political leadership that was in jail, was the first leader, and then a few years later he was deposed by Boumediene, who was in charge of the military at the time, and it was Boumediene who stayed in power for about a decade, and was one of the Arab leaders who died mysteriously. All these Arab nationalist leaders mysteriously died of rare forms of cancer. I don't know if so Nasser and so Boumediene was another example in the late 70s. But the military emerged as sort of the principal governing institution in Algeria, and that remains so to this day, as sort of an institution with immense prestige, as kind of the guardian of the nation.
Was that a fairly leftist government the first 10 years or so?
Yes, the Algerian government wasn't communist, although, and in fact, this is also important, I think, the French Communist Party opposed liberation for Algeria, but
Based on what?
well, it's there were a lot of the French settlers in Algeria were they had a very large working class community, and so it was this is the these are the politics of class versus race, and getting rid of national borders. Same thing. We have the same issue with Palestine, right? It was Stalin who sent massive supply of Czech weapons to support the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1947-48.
So when did you start making the connection between Algeria and Palestine? Has that kind of always been present, or was there a point where it kind of like Palestine came more on your radar and you started seeing the connections? Or
Yeah, it's a great question. So I for most of my career, I focused on antitrust law, which actually has some interesting parallels with the way the Zionist movement monopolized land in Palestine before the Nakba. But I was mainly focused on that, and then I started teaching a seminar on international law, before October 7th. Just trying to sort of find law and economic ways of thinking about international law. And then after October 7th, when it became clear to me that Israel was carrying out a genocide, I started to connect. International law was really transformed in the mid-20th century by these decolonization movements, precisely because decolonization was secession in so many cases, and that was a real problem for international law. How do we recognize a state that's a product of armed secession, which is illegal under international law, right? And so, there was a kind of a sui generis international law was developed specifically for states coming into being as a result of liberation from Western colonization. It didn't include Eastern there's Eastern empires also, right? Russia and China, that was left out. So there was a kind of special purpose Western decolonization law that was generated with the help, in part of the General Assembly passing resolutions as more and more decolonized countries came into the General Assembly, legitimating, these armed struggles. So I'd learned a bunch about that when I was teaching international law, and then when I saw the genocide unfolding, I said, well, what have I, can I take what I've learned about decolonization and international law and apply it to Israel? And as soon as you start looking at it, you realize, there's no difference in kind here. Even the formal, Israel is formally constituted as a separate state. It's not the 51st state. Despite the fact that we really function as the metropole supporting Israel. But that, if you look at the history of colonization, that's actually not uncommon. In South Africa, you had, several different statelets that were recognized. The Orange Free State, these were, settler states that were recognized. In fact, apartheid South Africa itself, it can be understood as being an example of, a colonization project that produces a separate state. Obviously, we can think about the United States in those terms as well. So that's, so I got into it from just connecting the dots between the study of international law and decolonization. And then, through the experience of my mother, I started focusing more on Algeria, which really is, if you want to see what a future liberated Palestine is going to look like. Not completely. Obviously, these are also very different countries. You have cultural differences as well as similarities. Fly to Algiers, visit Algiers, walk around downtown Algiers. It is preserved exactly as it was, not exactly, but almost exactly as it was in 1962. There hasn't been a lot of new construction in downtown Algiers. So you will be walking around what looks like a city in the south of France, with the balconies, right? The white painted buildings, whole thing. In 1961, you were taking your life in your hands if you were a native Algerian walking around in downtown Algiers, right? That's where the settlers lived. Today, virtually everyone you'll meet on the street is a native Algerian, and they all live in those buildings, right? And so it's a vision of what's downtown Tel Aviv going to look like after the liberation of Palestine? You're going to have Palestinians living there, right? And so you can really see it, and I think it's it can be somewhat moving, at least for me, when I think you can see the sea. One of the nice things about Algiers is it's sort of built on a hillside, and you look down towards the bay and the Mediterranean Sea. And if you were to start walking along that coast and keep going long enough, you would get to Gaza, right? This is one long coastline. And so, all you have to do is walk along the coast there to see, what the future is for Palestine.
I got confused at some point where you talked about the, the De Gaulle said, gave his decree that Algeria would be given back to the Algerians, basically. And then you start talking about I thought the FLN as the settler group who had been there for a long time.
I'm sorry, the FLN is the liberation movement of the native Algerians.
Of the native,
and the settler movement, that carried out armed resistance to decolonization was the OAS, the Secret Armed Organization.
Now I get it. Okay.
There's a lot of acronyms in this Algerian experience. Yeah. I'm still having trouble getting my head around all of them myself.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
Well, what you're talking about in terms of decolonization and going back to your state and whatever, it just reminds me so much of the Palestinian, in terms of the Palestinian situation, where the two-state solution versus the one-state solution. I mean, the two-state solution has been effectively wiped out by the Israeli government. I mean, they keep taking more and more of the West Bank land and having it all chopped up into Bantustan, sort of. And I was listening to a woman, I'm not sure what her name is, it might be Al Hassan, wonderful Palestinian woman who's I've seen on YouTube quite often. And she said, listen, when we liberate Palestine and it becomes a democratic secular state, because she's talking about a one-state solution, if they don't want to learn to live with us, then they can move. Because this is our country. It's not Israel's country, it's our country. They are the ones that invaded us and took over our land and stole our land, and and the whole thing with the map.
And that's the anti-colonial position,
Right.
And you cannot have. It's important to realize if you look at a map from 1945,
Mm-hmm.
Maps today are very colorful. A map from 1945 is almost monochrome because almost every country in the world belonged to either the British Empire, the French Empire, or was occupied by us, right? And that's it, including every single country in Africa except for Ethiopia.
Wow.
So, so within living memory, 85% of the world was dominated by the West.
Right.
Formally dominated.
Right.
And so, so that makes us really dangerous. That makes us very, very dangerous. And so when you have a colonization project like Israel in Palestine, it's the last Western colony in the Middle East, the last Western colony in Middle East and North Africa, which are usually, often grouped together as a unit. There's a few. Spain has a few, enclaves in Morocco, but basically the last Western colony. Its ability to persist and survive and expand, which is what it's doing right now, is a huge threat to the norm, the global norm against colonization, against Western colonization, that was established through the blood of millions of people fighting resistance movements all over the world in the 20th century. If it is able to persist, we're turning the clock back. The world becomes fair game again for Western colonization. And we're seeing already with the assault on Iran, something that would have been inconceivable if the genocide in Gaza had been brought to an end, through global condemnation. So so there's in sociology there's sociologist Durkheim, I think it was, had this concept of moral density. There's been the moral density with respect to colonization has been reduced greatly, and the longer Israel persists, the more it's reduced, and the more the global norm against colonization is eroded, and we find ourselves back in the monochrome map of 1945.
I just have one more question. What was it that led to you being suspended in relation to the Palestine stuff? And did you have an idea that was a potential consequence of what you were doing?
Yeah, so I circulated a petition to I'm a law professor, so we have an association, the Association of American Law Schools, which maintains discussion groups for law professors all over the country. So I circulated a petition, for international military intervention to bring Israel to an end. And so that was the immediate trigger, for the university suspending me. So I filed a lawsuit in November on First Amendment grounds, and so it's currently working its way through the courts. But obviously, there's not free speech about Palestine, as all of you I'm sure know very well. So that's it's not a new development, right? This is there's been a Palestine exception for free
Yes.
speech for decades.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, I was aware that there's a Palestine exception for free speech.
Okay.
I was also aware that it's unconstitutional.
Yes. Yes.
So,
All right.
yes.
Thank you.
Was there, someone hasn't spoken
So yeah, someone
back,
has
yeah.
asked. Yeah. Good job.
Yeah, I'm not a history buff at all and stuff, so I'm just looking for some clarification. When you speak of the decolonization of Israel, is that because pre-1945, when Israel was settled as part of the settlement of World War II and stuff, that it was Palestinian lands? So that really the decolonization of Israel is also the decolonization of Palestine in a way.
I apologize if I mistakenly said the decolonization of Israel at any point. I don't ever mean to use that term. I mean the decolonization of Palestine. I see Israel as the name for the colonization project in Palestine today. Is that responsive or?
I think so. So then, but where, kind of Israel, it was sort of like imposed upon upon Palestine in 1945, right? They're like, okay, the state of Israel is going to be formed. And is that considered, Palestine was colonized by Western powers by saying, okay, this is what's going to happen with this piece of land, and here all of these foreigners are kind of moving in, settlers, as it were. And are you speaking of that, or are you just speaking of what's had currently been termed Palestinian lands, like Gaza, the West Bank, part of Jerusalem, as Palestine now? Or are we going back to a...
So yeah, it's a great question. So from an international law perspective, the category would be sort of the borders of mandatory Palestine. So when the British colonized Palestine, it took control over Palestine, from the Ottoman Empire. There was the League of Nations, was in existence, and there was sort of a structure that was set up to think about many of the different parts of the Ottoman Empire that had been taken over by Western powers, and borders were drawn, and the British were given sort of control, which was understood to be sort of like tutelary control over Palestine. And the idea was eventually Palestine would be would be given to Palestinians to govern. But the British are going to exercise a kind of paternalistic control over the country for a while before that happens. So the entity that I'm thinking of when I think about what the borders of a decolonized Palestine would be the borders that were set as part of the British mandate under international law. So there is a defined border. There's actually an international law scholar.
Which in part of that territory that was the mandate into what had become what we know as Israel.
So, Israel, steadfastly refuses to sort of acknowledge what its borders are for obvious reasons, because it's hoping to continue to expand them. So there is, there's a fact of the matter about what the borders of mandatory Palestine are. And so generally when I think about what a decolonized Palestine, what the borders would be, it would be the borders of mandatory Palestine as they were set in the 1920s. There's a professor of international law at Ohio State, John Quigley, who's done some great work on this question, and he makes a book called The Statehood of Palestine. I have to say it's very dry, but it's because he's a very sort of meticulous international law scholar. But basically what he argues is that the British mandate actually brought Palestine into existence as an international legal entity along the borders of mandatory Palestine. And so it already exists, and what we're just viewing is a struggle for governmental control over that territory. And so, from his perspective, the Zionist movement is, effectively through military force has taken control over all of that territory, administers it in different ways. if it's, if you're in Gaza or you're in the West Bank, you get treated a lot differently from whether you're within, the 1948 lands. But it's effectively has de facto control over that entire territory. But but Palestine itself already exists. It's simply, colonized, right? One of the interesting things about Algeria and the FLN is the FLN insisted that liberation should be for the entire colonial border. So there's a lot of precedent of colonized peoples insisting that they get the entire country as defined by the colonizer, border-wise. Now, there's it's very common to talk about, well, the colonizers drew the borders and it caused all these problems, But actually, from a liberation perspective, the borders drawn by colonizers were actually very helpful. It was certainly helpful to the Algerians because the French didn't want to give up the Sahara. Oil had been found there during the Algerian War for Liberation, and the French had a nuclear program, which, by the way, they, it had shared with the Israelis. So the origin of the Israeli nuclear program comes from technology transfer from the French that was done during the Algerian War, in part because the French wanted to legitimate another Western colony on the Mediterranean. Right? And so the French started testing nuclear weapons in the Sahara Desert, and to this day, we have, Algerians suffer some of the effects of that testing. They didn't want to give up the Sahara. So at some point they were saying, well, okay, you can have the north, but we want to keep the Sahara. And the FLN said, no, it's, we take the entire package. Also, as relevant to Palestine, the settlers talked about, hey, can we just, let's keep Algiers as a settler state, and the Algerians can get the rest of the country, right? So, just like Israel-Palestine, but the Algerians had something going for them that the Palestinians, haven't, and that is the demographic issue. So the French settlers were 1/9 of the population of Algeria. It's 9 to 1. That's in Palestine today. It's about equal. Obviously with the diaspora, Palestinians, outnumber Israelis, but not even then. Even if you take the diaspora into account, it's not 9 to 1. And so you can, when you look at colonization, it's really it's really a tragedy that the colonized peoples who have demography on their side have tended to get independence. The colonized peoples that don't have demography on their side, like native peoples here, don't. Right, and part of that, and this is another reason why I think we have to be very skeptical of the assimilationist approach, which is, there's a tendency to say, well, let's just have a referendum, right? And it's like, if you do these, the Algerians were fine. In fact, the Evian Accords were sealed with a referendum. Referenda are great when you have the demography on your side, right? So then you can, we can play at it's a democratic choice. Right, but if you don't, you can't do that. And so I think the foundation for anti-colonialism can't be a kind of blind, democratic assimilationist approach. And that's why I think it's really important, not to just sort of translate our own internal American political values of, assimilation and democracy over to the Palestine question or any decolonial question.
Right.
We see this now. There's some French colonies today in the Pacific. And in fact we have one here. Hawaii.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Where because of this demographic thing, where the settlers outnumber the locals, you're stuck if you take the democratic approach to decolonization.
Right.
Thank you.
Could you tell us how it might happen that Palestine could win independence? Because all of us working in this, we're very discouraged because there's just nothing but torture and occupation happening right now.
Yeah.
And we get to talk a lot to people who just come back and they're very discouraged. So it sounds like you feel there's a good chance Palestine can follow in the steps in that area. But I don't know how do you envision that could happen?
It's a great question. So, I mean, I tend to be, Algeria is an interesting microcosm to think about, or just model for this because of what happened with politics in France. I think it's, as I tried to emphasize in this talk, it's very interesting to me that it was a right-wing France firster who cut the cord. But they're important, I've been emphasizing the parallels. There's also important differences. I mean, one is, with Algeria, it wasn't the settler community for the most part that was doing the fighting. So one of the things that's really allowed Israel to persist is that the settlers do the dying. And so Israel is a colonization project. It's a Western colonization project. You can make a good case that today it's an American colonization project because of the amount of support. But the fact that the settlers generally do the dying to preserve the colony has huge political implications here. Because for the American public, support for Israel is costless. Okay, money, it costs something in money, but it doesn't cost anything in blood, or at least it hasn't cost us a lot in blood. Right? And so, and that's really different from the experience, that we had in Vietnam, and also the experience that the French had, where they had 500,000, young French people out there, getting killed, fighting to maintain the colony. And, when the metropole starts losing its own, then you can get political resistance at home that really has traction. I'm skeptical that, I would love it to be the case, but I'm skeptical that absent that kind of skin in the game, like literal skin in the game, that you can get a lot of traction in the metropole for decolonization. So, when you look at what's going on now with Iran, I think it's very significant that this is the first time that we have gone to war explicitly to defend Israel. We didn't, in Iraq, and a lot of us were like, yeah, obviously this is about defending Israel, but it wasn't sold to the American people that way. But this war has been explicitly announced as being about defending Israel. And so, when Americans die in this war, they have to ask, is this blood, worth, is Israel worth this blood that's being spilled? And so, if we see, I suspect that Americans have very little appetite for dying to maintain a colony in Palestine. I mean, there's much less to recommend Israel to Americans than there was to recommend Algeria to the French. If you were a Frenchman and you wanted to move to Algeria and live there, all you had to do was get on a boat. It was France, right? You had full political rights. If you're an American who's fighting and dying for Israel, you can't just show up in Israel and get full political rights, right? So, there's, it's maintaining a colony that offers very little by way of benefit to the average American. And so, if we were to see a ground invasion of, but there's other issues here, right? So Algeria is a huge country. It's one of the biggest countries in Africa, vast territory, and people associate North Africa for some reason with deserts, but it's not just deserts. Algeria has some of the tallest mountains in Africa, and so and it was in the mountains that the FLN guerrillas were able to hide out and persist. So Algeria had the benefit not just of population but also of terrain. If you look at the Middle East, I mean, you can literally do a political heat map that corresponds directly to elevation. So what are the low-lying parts of the Middle East? Saudi Arabia, Jordan, right? These are all countries that are effectively in our orbit because they're not militarily defensible, right, easily. What are the countries that are resisting? Well, Yemen, mountainous, right? Iran, mountainous. So there's, so you have more defensible parts of the Middle East that are able to maintain their independence. So if we do a ground invasion of Iran, which is a mountainous country, I suspect it would be a quagmire. It would be like a Vietnam-style quagmire. totally unlike Iraq, which is not an except in the north where the Kurds are, it's a flat territory. And so if we get mired in a quagmire explicitly in defense of the state of Israel, now we start to have the same colonial dynamic, metropole settler dynamic that you had in Algeria or that we had in Vietnam in a way, which is we have American soldiers dying to defend an overseas colonial interest. And that's the point at which the France firsters or the America firsters, start to have a lot of traction, politically in resisting the war and in coalition with folks on the left as well. I don't.
Send a lot of soldiers there and they die. That's how Palestine's going to win. I don't know if it doesn't, it might not happen that we send a lot of soldiers there. So
I think militarily, I think at the end of the day, if we don't have American soldiers who are in harm's way to defend Israel, it's unlikely that American public opinion is going to, that's what I was trying to say, the American public opinion is going to stop this. And so the alternative is, it's armed resistance in the Middle East and in Palestine. We've been talking about a lot of folks have been talking about Suez in the context of the Strait of Hormuz. Suez was a disaster for France and Britain because America wasn't willing to support the project, right? It wasn't a military disaster. They actually succeeded at taking control. So, I think that, a Western coalition probably could take control over the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not clear who would be the spoiler, right? So you have China, which is a rising power, has been very hands-off, right? In relation to other, great powers, over the period of the 20th century. It'd be very hands-off, unclear that they would play the role of spoiler in that calculus. So, I agree, it's not clear what the path to liberation is in Palestine, but I'm convinced that liberation will happen. If we look at this is the last Western colony in the Middle East, right? And if we look at the history of decolonization, I think it points in one direction only. So one way or another, it's going to have to happen.
Earlier, Richard was talking about, you were talking about people that weren't Palestinian in Palestine, the Israelis potentially being given the choice to stay or to leave. And but they, if anybody's going to leave, it should be them. And it should be if the Palestinians want them there or not. And I know that recently a lot of Israelis have been burning property in Argentina and in making plans to settle there. And I guess also Cyprus, they've been heavily infiltrating that. And especially in terms of Patagonia, what did you say?
Argentina?
Argentina. What do you see them as, if they face the situation that Algeria did, them just saying, okay, we're going to Argentina, Cyprus, other places?
Yeah, it's possible. One can't say for sure, but if you look at not just Algeria, but the history of decolonization, one thing is colonized peoples usually do, and as far as I'm aware, every Palestinian political faction has offered citizenship in a liberated Palestine to the colonizer population. So while my view is, as a matter of sort of the law and the morality of decolonization, the Palestinians should have a right to decide. In fact, they have suggested that they would want the colonizer population to stay, and the reason is because the colonizers often have they have a lot of human capital and technical expertise and financial capital, all things that are very useful to a newly decolonized country. And so, so often, the resistance wants the colonizer to stay. They don't want the offshoring of assets. They don't want the loss of technical expertise. They don't want all of that. They want people to stay. And but the colonizer leaves.
But is this perhaps atypical given the mindset of the overwhelming majority of Israelis and the intense hatred?
Yeah, I mean, it's it seems like it's what's much more likely to happen is something that's
you would
like
leave.
something that's like what happened with the French settlers in Algeria. I agree. I think it's much more likely that they would leave, and I think that's also something that we need to spend time thinking about, which is in a decolonized Palestine, how do we think about reparations now? How do we think about there's been there's a tremendous amount of wealth that's been poured into supporting this colonization project. As a law professor, when I think about remedies, if I'm doing an antitrust case, I think about remedies. We say not only do you want compensation for harm, you want disgorgement of profits generated from the illegal monopolizing activity. And you also want punitive damages, which are additional payments that are meant to create a deterrence effect. So that future Western colonization projects say, boy, this would be a really bad idea to start this again, because look what happened last time. Look at the bill from that came due after what happened last time. And so, how can we think about a Palestine liberation scenario in which we ensure that assets are not offshored, that we ensure that there's scope for not both sort of criminal liability for individuals, but also for the kind of financial reparations that create a deterrent effect on future colonization projects.
I just want to say a simple question is, what about international law? Been totally brutalized, stomped on, destroyed almost. Countries don't pay attention to it, only when it benefits them. How is that to be addressed?
I don't think we have a genuine international law yet. And I think that's why the thing that we call international law seems to be this insubstantial stuff that just gets violated whenever it's in the interest of those in power to violate it. What we understand to be law is a system in which the weak, through collective action, are able to impose rules and norms on the strong as well as each other. What we have now is not that. I mean, the UN system was created, it was created by Jan Smuts, who was the head of apartheid South Africa, right? It was explicitly created as a method for ensuring that the great colonial powers would stop fighting each other, because that was delegitimizing them in the eyes of the colonized peoples. This was explicit, a premise, Smuts' premise for working on the UN project. And now we think of it as a democratic thing because so many colonized peoples fought and died for liberation, and they were able to get their independent countries to join the General Assembly. So we think of it as being a democratic thing, but it was never conceived to be a democratic structure. And and until we have enough unity among countries of the global south, among countries, formerly colonized countries, and frankly, a willingness of these countries to go to war, to enforce international law norms, to go to war against Western powers, to enforce international law norms, we're not going to have anything that really feels like what we understand law to be, which is the rule of the weak imposed on the strong.
And that's is that what got you in trouble? Like you said you were advocating a military force
Yes.
to enforce what a law, a series of laws, and that's what they went after you for.
Yes, that's right. So my petition said, the countries of the world need to get together and form a coalition and go to war against Israel to bring the colonization project to an end, because the colonization of Palestine is a threat to the global norm against Western colonization. So every decolonized country, Algeria included, should be very worried about the precedent that's set by the persistence of the state of Israel. And so, smaller countries need to get together and say, look, it's our international law. We want to have a norm against colonization, and we're going to enforce the norm. And so part of my inspiration for the petition was looking at the states that filed genocide lawsuit against Israel. Right? South Africa led that lawsuit, and there's about a dozen states that have joined or said that they would join that suit. And you look at this and you say, is this serious? Like, do they really think, the International Court of Justice, first of all, it's left over from the League of Nations period. So, the UN was formed by people who thought international law was a joke and ineffective, and it had been proved ineffective by the failure of the League of Nations, and therefore we needed a policy-making body, not a law-making body, a policy-making body to run the world, and that's the Security Council. So the UN is a post-international law institution. The ICJ is a holdover from it was founded much earlier to adjudicate international law back in the early 20th century, when it was thought that we could have an international law. And so it has no enforcement power, none, right? It can issue a decision and that's it. So, so I was looking at this and I was saying, we have a genocide going on, and the solution is to ask a powerless, adjudicative dinosaur to say it's bad.
Right.
We're right at about an hour and a half, so it's okay if the next question can be the last one?
Yes, absolutely. I think.
Well, I the whole idea that the council, what's it called, United Nations, the Supreme Council, whatever, 15
Security Council.
Security Council, makes the rules, and that there are 5 countries that can just stop anything from happening, to me is bullshit. I mean, there's no reason why they need the Security Council to do that. They should just be, hey, whatever the entire body votes on, maybe you need a 2/3 majority, whatever. But I mean, that's what's going to be the law, because the fact that, the United States, France, Britain, China, or Russia can stop any law from passing, any action from passing is ludicrous. And that sort of plays into the hand you were just saying about the League of Nations. If it has no power, or can stop the people that think that something should be done from having anything done, because basically the rest of the people in the rest of the countries, I should say, in the United Nations are like second fiddle. They don't have a say. I mean, they have a say, but it doesn't mean anything, because the Security Council will always overrule them. And then, Israel keeps talking about how many times has the UN ruled against Israel? And, well, a lot of times it doesn't happen because the United States always stops the ruling from taking place. And that's such bullshit.
The UN was meant, really to be a policy-making body that recognized, the existence of power and power politics, not a lawmaking organization. And, the flip side is, look, if the countries that joined the genocide lawsuit all collectively declared war on Israel, I don't think there would be a shooting battle, because I don't think, any Western country supporting Israel would be willing to handle, a coalition threatening war consisting of countries from every continent on Earth. I mean, that would be a threat to the power of, of the West that I don't think that the West could countenance. I think that it would say, it's not worth the trouble.
Right.
So, so I think that there's a lack of, and you don't need the Security Council to approve that. You can just do it. So a lot of the sort of, a lot of countries that spend time appealing to the UN and doing these sort of, votes and then, getting vetoed, I don't think they're really serious. It's a sort of a performative aspect. It's like, well, we tried, and the UN isn't going to do it. So
Was the League of Nations a lawmaking body?
yes, it was
And why did it fail?
Hitler.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Wow.